Religion is one of those things that pretty much everyone has, but it's often hard to define. And so I want to start our conversation today with simply asking the question, what is religion? If we were having this conversation face to face, I would leave a long, awkward, pregnant pause, pregnant with, triplets or something. Because we tend to just think of it in terms of our own religion, but even so, we ask ourselves the question, what is religion? Is it being Christian? Is it going to church? Is it praying? Is it belief in God? What if belief in God is a requirement in order to make the cut for religion? Then does that mean that Buddhism, particularly Zen Buddhism, which doesn't have a personal deity as an object, does that count as a religion then? Have we excluded them? And so it seems like defining religion can actually be somewhat tricky. Do we define religion in such a way that it doesn't differ at all from culture, something that provides meaning and gives life value and points us towards an ultimate end, um, or a worldview for that matter? And so, what is religion? Maybe pause the video for a moment and just write down your answer. What would you say religion is before you've had a moment to think about it? Now that you've thought about it, here's a really great definition from a man named Winfrey Cordovan. He wrote a book called Neighboring Faiths, which, in my opinion, is one of the better books on the topic of interfaith dialogue from a Christian perspective. He says religion is a system of beliefs and practices that provides values that give life meaning and coherence by directing a person towards transcendence. It's a system of beliefs and practices. So it includes both the rational, the mind, and the action, the doing, and it provides value and gives life meaning. There is a purpose behind these beliefs and practices, and not just meaning, but coherence. Oftentimes when people talk to another person of a different religion that they can't quite comprehend, we like to ask those, what I call Jenga questions. A Jenga question is, it's the notion that I'm going to ask you one question, and just like pulling the wrong block from the game Jenga, your worldview is going to come crashing down. Only very rarely, if ever, does that actually happen. In reality, usually the other person, or sometimes if the question's being asked to ourselves, we're not that impressed with it. And that's because we underestimate the value of coherence. One question or one problem does not necessarily disrupt the coherence provided by a religion. And then the coherence and all of the life meaning and whatnot is not simply for the here and now, but it directs us to something beyond ourselves. And so this definition would include all the monotheistic religions, and it would also include all of the Eastern religions that may have an impersonal deity or no deity at all as its object. When we talk about other religions, and I think this is true for every person, every sincere believer in whatever religion they practice, it's easy to get worried. On many points, religions do seem to say similar things, sometimes the same thing. And when we start saying the same things, everyone worries, so what does it matter if I am my religion then? And again, Cordovan has a great answer to this. He says, one need not give away the Christian claims of uniqueness. In fact, if Christianity is true, it is only reasonable to expect that, wherever truth is found, it will tie into the truth of Christianity in some way. And I think obviously other religions might see this statement and change the word Christian for their own religion, and probably agree with this statement. If something is true, we should expect to see it in other religions. If we find truth in another religion, that should not worry us. That should point us to the fact that this is true. For instance, we see that 2 plus 2 equals 4. It would be a weird thing if throughout the rest of the world we never saw that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Now, I'm not saying I am not a pluralist, I'm not a universalist. I don't think that everyone is saved each to their own end or each through my system. But at the same time, humans in our story are created by God, and we have an initial common set of information. And so from this, from an anthropological standpoint, we should see certain traits in human behavior and even within human worldviews and information repeating themselves. Cordovan highlights two basic problems when it comes to interfaith dialogue. He says, there are times when we make things too simple for ourselves. It's easier to deal with a religion as we imagine it to be than as it really is. There are two ways in which this tendency frequently exemplifies itself. Number one, comparing our best with their worst. And number two, addressing the character of another religion rather than the religion itself. Now, Cordovan is speaking, of course, to Christians, and this is certainly two problems that we exhibit again and again and again, but we could level the playing field and say that all people of faith probably do this at some point in their life. And these are definitely problems. Comparing our best with their worst is never a convincing argument when we do that. I see this with Muslims and Christians, where Christians want to talk to Muslims and we want to cite terrorism, or we want to cite the Islamic invasions, when at the same time, if we level the playing field, there's many things in our history that we overlook in those statements, and that they would cite back to us. And so I try not to use something that will just get used back on me again. And then addressing a character of another religion rather than the religion itself, again, a very common problem where we don't seek to understand what is going on. We make an assumption, we make it a generalization, and from that generalization, we move on. While we often do this to other people, we really react when people do this back to us. And so I have a quote here from Richard Dawkins, his book, The God Delusion. He's a very strident atheist. And he says, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser, a misogynist, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, I can't even say it, he's got so many words, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Now that is a mouthful, and I certainly tripped, and I don't think I've ever read this publicly without some sort of trip. But surely if you're a believer, this strikes you at an emotional level in a kind of offensive way. Maybe it makes you sad for him, for someone who is so misunderstood the God that we know for his steadfast love. Maybe it makes you sad on his behalf to not have any understanding of who he is. Maybe it makes you angry to be attacked. But the only thing it's not going to make you is convinced. And so he takes his worst impression that he could possibly muster, and the most human vocabulary known to mankind, in order to mount an attack. And at the end of the day, we sit here and we're either sad or angry or indifferent, but we're certainly not convinced and motivated to change. I think one thing that people forget as we talk about interfaith dialogue or intercultural dialogue is that religion and culture is people, not ideas. People say, well, I want to address culture. I want to impact culture. Okay. And what they mean is that culture somehow resides out there in the netherworld, out there in space somewhere. And in some way we can, almost like it's a set of code that's out there being pumped into the system down here. And if we just re-enter a particular line of code, it will change the culture. And we see religion the same way. So religion is this set of ideas and practices, and we're going to engage it, and immediately we think of the Hindu temple or the Buddhist temple, or we think of places of worship, we think of prayer gatherings. Very rarely do we think of people. In reality, the only place that any religion resides is in people. If all of the people of a particular religion died, the religion is over. There is no more. You might have artifacts that are left over from the religion, but artifacts is all you would have. But this impacts how we see people. We can't study a set of principles and then study, the tricks of how to defeat them. We need to see people as people, not as isms. Everyone wants to focus, particularly in today's world, on Muslim women, on Muslim men, and we put the religion title first, when in reality, Muslim women at their basic core are just women. Muslim men are just men. And so the same things that you and I, as men and women, struggle with, have aspirations towards, have fears about, are the same things that they do as well. And so we need to see them as people first, and then afterwards let them tell us what their beliefs are. So what about other religions? We've already talked about the 5 ways that two things can relate from Niebier's Christ and Culture. But if you think of 2 circles, you could have A and B as separate circles. There's no correlation whatsoever. Then you could make A and B intersect so that there's a little bit of A, a little bit of B, and then a little bit of AB in the middle. So that's the second way. Then you could take the 2 circles and overlap them exactly. So A and B are one thing. And then the final 2 would be A being a smaller circle inside of the B circle, or the opposite, B being a smaller circle inside the A circle. And so this is kind of philosophical or theological, as in the case of Niebuhr. But if we get down to evangelism, we can kind of see how some of these play out. So with David Hasselgrave, who's a very well-known missiologist, he sees other religions as enemy territory. So he sees A and B as completely separate circles. There's no real point of contact that he really wants. There's no bridge that he wants to walk across. At the opposite end of the spectrum, you could see Vatican II, the Catholic Council, espousing pluralism, where all sincere persons of faith are saved eventually and ultimately through Jesus. And so for them, other religions are not that big of a problem that can't be overcome. Winfrey Corduan, on the other hand, sees religions as a kind of tapestry that in some way harken back, and we'll talk more about some of his views on original monotheism in another lecture. But between the ideas of original monotheism and tapestry, you see his views where he's between the two of Vatican II and David Hasselgrave. And probably very closely aligned with Corduan, though from a much different philosophical basis, is Don Richardson. He's very famous. He wrote a book back in the 70s called Peace Child. But he coined the phrase, not in that book, but in a different one called Eternity in Their Hearts, he coined the phrase redemptive analogy. And he was serving in Papua New Guinea, and he started seeing really, really strange cultural practices take place. He would see a tribe who has no contact with the outside world, no Bible of any kind, no missionary of any kind, no church of any kind. He would see them do a ritual where they would, once a year, take 2 chickens, kill one, and put it on a raft. Leave that one alive, put it on a raft, and everyone would take a leaf and put it on the raft with the live chicken, and then they would kill the other chicken. Then they would take the chicken on the raft, and they would push it out into the water. And their belief was that if the chicken floated away and stayed away, they would be okay for the next year, and the gods would bless them. But if the chicken came back, this was a sign of the gods' displeasure. And if you think for a moment through your Old Testament stories, this very closely mirrors the scapegoat, so closely that it's an undeniable connection. But that begs the question, how did they get the story? Where did the story come from for them? It's clearly changed and adapted to their local context, and it's very different. So here are some other examples from culture. So his basic idea of redemptive analogy is that God in his grace has put things, cultural practices, information, into every single culture that can be used as a bridge to walk people across. And when we find that, that is the open door that we're looking for. So here's a Chinese character. This is the character for boat. That's the character at the top there, and if you see the bottom row of sub-characters, these are the sub-characters that make up the main character. And boat is comprised of vessel, eight, and people. You can see all three of those parts there. Which, if we think about a biblical story that was a vessel with 8 people on it, we come back to the flood story with Noah and his family. Here's the character for create. This is comprised of speak, dust, life, and walk. So Chinese characters are thousands and thousands of years old, and at some point in time there was contact. They had knowledge of the one true God, and that impacted their language, and it's been recorded and preserved here. Here's the word for garden, and it's comprised of dust, breath, 2 persons, enclosures, and enclosure. So as we think about all of these characters and what a redemptive analogy is, I want you to look at this final picture for a moment and tell me what you see. Maybe pause the video. But if you look at this, not so much at the painting or the scripting, this is a Chinese New Year's decoration. But if you look very symbolically at the colors and where the colors are placed, what do you see? Do you see blood across the doorposts? I think it's there. And so redemptive analogies, as Richardson argues, can be used as points of contact. And so the book that he wrote about his own story, called Peace Child, he had gone in and shared the gospel with the tribe, and they weren't antagonistic, they were just indifferent. And then after a while he learned about this ritual that they had, where when 2 tribes were warring, each one would exchange a baby with the other tribe. And as long as that baby was alive, that there would be peace between the 2 tribes, because you're not going to attack a tribe that has one of your kids in it. And so he used that as an analogy to talk about Jesus as the peace child between God and man, which the scary part of that story then becomes we messed up and we killed the peace child. And so we have great reason to be afraid. And when he shared this story with them and used that analogy, many, many people came to faith.